Real quick, I'd like to bring some attention to this cool engineer loadout I've discovered, but let me know what you think. I could use some thoughts here. The L'étranger, a gun that's closer to me than my own son. And I may be a terrible parent, but that's only because I'm able to hide from him so effectively thanks to this thing. I think most can agree that certain unique weapons have become surrogate stock loadouts for certain classes. The gunboats on Soldier, crossbow on Medic, power jack for Pyro, while these weapons aren't always used by players, they're much more common to see than their actual stock alternatives. And for me, personally, the L'étranger has filled that role for Spy. It is extremely rare for you to watch me play, which you can do on my Twitch channel, and see me without this thing. And when I'm not using it, I'm probably just missing a lot of headshots with the Ambassador before soon switching back. Now, I could go over the stats of this weapon and conclude, yeah, it's pretty good. But I think the L'étranger is a perfect weapon to use as a case study as to why a weapon could be considered good at all. A while back, I made a video about all of Spy's revolvers and my basic opinions on each of them. And I'll be real, it's a pretty weak video. I barely had much to say about each gun and just threw out some takes I had and put it into a script. So because of that, I'm gonna be doing the L'étranger its due diligence. It's a weapon that's practically defined my playstyle and I want to give it some more respect. Alright, well I said I wouldn't go right into stats, but I think 2 of the 3 are pretty easy to explain, so let's go into the first. A 20% damage penalty. This section of the script was initially much more complicated, going deep into the topic of hits to kill and trying to explain this really fun graph I made, showing how many hits are required to kill each class with each gun. I'm still showing it in the video because I do think the theory is important and valuable to learn from, so take a longer look at it if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of things.
A nice thing that I garnered from this data is that, specifically, 125 health classes can be killed in the same number of shots as the revolver. Both weapons will always require at least 3 shots. You can also often eke out a 4-shot kill on midway classes like Pyro or Demo, provided you keep somewhat close to them.
The thing really struggles with taking out full health soldiers and heavies, but if that's the situation you're in, number theory probably won't save you. The other big hit the L'étranger takes is with medics. The revolver can somewhat comfortably 3-shot a medic at mid to close range. Meanwhile, the L'étranger always needs at least 4. Being able to take out a medic quickly is pretty huge, so this is quite the downside unfortunately. Numbers aside though, what does the damage penalty actually feel like in game? Like I said, you can kill certain classes a lot more quickly than you think with this thing, and it's especially relevant against weaker classes like Sniper or other spies. But even an engineer alone is already pretty capable of outdamaging a spy in a gunfight assuming he hits his shots, let alone a spy using this pea shooter. Winning fights with the L'étranger is often less a matter of you hitting your shots and more hoping that the enemy misses theirs, because if the latter doesn't happen, you'll lose the fight a vast majority of the time. This effect is so strong that it actually has a weirdly psychological effect on the way you play Spy. A lot of the people who watch my stream often, rightfully so, make fun of my Spy gameplay because I refuse to use my revolver, even in situations where it makes a lot of sense to do so. And because of this lack of practice, when I do use my gun, I miss so many of my shots. It's honestly pretty embarrassing. But the reason I use my gun so rarely likely has a lot to do with my revolver of choice, the L'étranger of course. It's a weapon that inherently discourages you from using your gun and encourages you to use every other tool you have instead. So this is a weird thing to say about one of my favorite weapons in the game, but if you use the L'étranger, be careful to not forget about your gun entirely. Yes, it's weaker, yes, you'll lose a lot of fights, but sometimes you really should still use it, and it may just surprise you. And after all, there are other reasons to fire this thing than just to kill enemies, so let's move on to that. The next stat on the list, on every hit you land with the L'étranger, you regen 15% of your cloak meter. This one is hard to analyze, partially because it's an upside on a weapon that is entirely defined by the other upside that it has. It can be useful. If you're ever low on cloak and need to regen it a bit faster, shoot some enemies, simple as. There are a few little issues that make this hard to take advantage of though. Firstly, with the L'étranger being so clearly not great at direct combat, you probably wouldn't be trying to regain cloak via damaging enemies when you're in enemy territory. Because your gun does quite a bit less damage, you only want to do direct combat in enemy territory when you have to and have no other choice, not to just randomly try to regain some cloak. Now, this could actually be spun around as follows. If you take out someone with the L'étranger, there's a good chance that you now have enough cloak to escape, which seems pretty good, right? Well, this assumes a few things. One, you didn't just die fighting whoever you're fighting, and you're using the L'Étranger, so I don't know. And two, you are fighting only a single enemy, and any other enemies who might have seen you didn't also kill you during the fight, or were far enough away to not immediately be a threat to you and gave you time to cloak. And three, any other enemies didn't just kill you while you were invisible anyway. So then, summarized, regenerating cloak in enemy territory with the L'Étranger is not the most consistent move. How about regenerating cloak in friendly territory though? Well, you're already safe. You can probably go run and find a dispenser or an ammo kit to regain cloak anyway. If, however, you are specifically somewhere where you will not be immediately picked off, can shoot enemies but are far enough away from them, and are not anywhere nearby a good source of ammo, this stat has a bit of use. I'm not saying this stat is worthless at all. A bit of cloak gained here and there with a few potshots can come in handy for sure, especially if you have the Dead Ringer equipped, which actually, oh yeah, if this stat didn't exist, the Dead Ringer would have almost no synergy with the L'Étranger.
And synergy it has. Over my time working on this video, I realized more and more that the L'Étranger actually combos pretty alright with the Dead Ringer. Granted, it's far from the best, since the L'Étranger means your knife is not your best combat tool, and the Dead Ringer makes it way harder to sneak around behind enemies, but hey. If you're in a map with lots of flank routes or enemies that are slower to catch on to you, this strat is surprisingly effective and fun. You'd be surprised how quickly you can get your charge back with even just a few shots. Aside from the Dead Ringer synergy though, I had to try really hard to even get footage of me getting actual use out of this stat without just forcing it. It's less a stat that you try to take advantage of actively, and more of a passive stat that happens to regenerate your cloak on the occasion that you have to shoot someone.
We aren't even at the crux of the weapon yet, and we've already covered number theory and game theory, so it's time to discuss some philosophy. In order to dissect why a 40% increase in cloak duration is so wildly important, we need to ask this: what makes a weapon good? Or more specifically, what makes a stat on a weapon good? I think I can break this down into two general categories: applicability and capability. Capability is how powerful any individual stat is. For example, the primary stat on the power jack is very capable. Moving 10% faster is a very powerful ability. Meanwhile, the 25 health regained on kill is not very powerful. Both of these stats are upsides, but one is clearly more effective than the other. However, half of the reason why that's the case is the applicability of said stat. Applicability is a combination of how easy it is to take advantage of a stat and how often you actually want to do so. The power jack is still a great example of this, because the faster movement speed is both very worth using as much as you can, and is incredibly easy to activate, just holding out the weapon. This thing is the perfect example of a weapon that is both highly applicable and highly capable. It lets you move faster, which is already great. There are loads of situations in which moving faster is useful, and actually triggering the faster movement speed is very easy. Thus, the power jack is a pretty damn good weapon. Now then, the L'Étranger. We have a downside that's certainly noticeable but possible to work around. An upside that's mostly ignored but has uses here and there.
And finally, we have what I hope my firstborn child's first words would be.
Hey, he doesn't know my name, but at least he knows a good weapon when he sees one. A plus 40% cloak duration. This increases the cloak time for the stock watch from 10 seconds to 14 seconds, the cloak and dagger from 6.6 to 9.3 seconds while running, and the dead ringer from 7 to 8.2 seconds. The graph on the screen is technically just for the Invis watch, but the ratios should be the same for the other watches, so the visualization should still work. There's a lot more data on the wiki if you want specific numbers. The difference in time here is absolutely massive, and if the numbers won't do it for you, here's an example. Starting from blue spawn and Badwater, the default cloak time gets you right up to this corner here. Meanwhile, using the L'Étranger, you're able to go past there and just barely enter the stairwell on B point. All the way from spawn, I didn't even write that in the script. I was just kind of realizing, damn, that's a long distance. Yeah, it's a crazy weapon. It's cool. Let's keep going. On upward, the stock gets you just up to this hill here, and the L'Étranger gets you all the way to the upper entrance to the tunnel. Obviously, this is pretty neat, but what really matters here isn't the raw distance you can cover, but the time you have in cloak. Both of these examples are played on an empty server, and anyone who's played Spy knows that it's never as simple as cloaking and going from point A to point B. You need to dodge around enemies, wait for them to pass, figure out where you're going next without getting bumped. All that takes a lot of time. And if you ever run out of cloak in the wrong spot, it's pretty much lights out. Because of the longer cloak meter, the L'Étranger drastically increases your chances of getting where you need to go. To put it in other words, this weapon seriously reduces the amount of lives you'll waste just running out of cloak and getting killed. 40% more cloak is just enough to get you in the midst of almost any setup, and it's hard to fully get across the idea of how much more effective you'll be in a game if you waste less time respawning. Dying less is so important as Spy, any class, but especially Spy. And if you're dying less often due to running out of cloak, it means that you're spending more times doing things like, I don't know, stabbing people, sapping buildings, hanging out, chilling with the boys, doing things you want to do. Something else really important to note, despite your cloak lasting way longer, the rate at which it regens is exactly the same. Not only over time regen, but via ammo pickups and dispensers too. Your cloak meter isn't 40% longer, it just depletes 40% slower. What that means is that if you're in a pinch and you find a random medium ammo pickup somewhere, that gives you 7 seconds of cloak back instead of just 5. I know at this point it's probably entirely self-explanatory, but it's important to note that this stat is always benefiting you, even in situations other than just cloaking to get behind the enemy in the first place. And the real secret sauce to why the slower cloak drain rate is so beneficial: cloaking is really good. Being invisible is Spy's absolute best stealth tool, bar none. And I'm going to take a moment here to stress how important stealth is for Spy. I know it's another thing that seems really obvious, but just trust me on this. If you've seen my video on the Eternal Reward, you may remember a concept I discussed when arguing for the weapon. The enemy not knowing you're around at all is so much more consistent than trying to do anything else to trick them. The L'Étranger allows you to compromise your strongest stealth tool, your cloak, drastically less often. You don't need to gamble on uncloaking early and being heard. You're more often able to take a longer but safer route to your destination. Anything you can do to eliminate possibilities for the enemy to spot you, the L'Étranger allows you to do just a bit better. And as I've said countless times on this channel, being just a tiny bit more consistent when it comes to playing Spy is so important because you're an all or nothing class. Alright, so that's half of why this stat is so good. The other reason calls back to our discussion of capability and applicability, and how a 40% decreased cloak drain rate absolutely crushes both of those categories. We just spent the last 2 minutes or so talking about how cloaking is both really important and is almost always important to do, barring obvious circumstances like stabbing people and sapping. So then, when you have a weapon that passively makes your most important stealth tool way more effective, as a class that almost entirely relies on being stealthy to get kills, yeah, this thing's pretty good. So long as you aren't doing a funky gun spy, dead ringer, or whatever, the L'Étranger is almost always benefiting the player. Even if you don't get a kill, even if you just get one kill, everything about your job as Spy is made easier. The Diamondback is so often considered an absolutely busted weapon, but guess what? The thing is worthless before you get any stabs or any buildings sapped. It requires you to do something before any of its upsides come into play, and it's something as difficult as stabbing people. That can be way harder than it seems, or sapping a building. Stuff happens. Meanwhile, the L'Étranger benefits you from the moment you spawn to the moment you die. Being able to more effectively cloak and regen more cloak with ammo packs and the like constantly opens up more opportunities for you, and allows you to play for less risk and more reward. I am seriously this close to considering whether or not to title this video, "The L'Étranger is better than the Diamondback," but I think I'll still my tongue for now, even if there's an argument to be made. Oh, I almost forgot, it actually makes the YER usable. Yeah, it goes up here. I think I've been repeating myself for a real portion of this video, but it's hard not to do. Cloaking is very good and something you do all the time, and the L'Étranger consistently benefits your cloak regardless of any circumstances. For even more proof, getting footage for this video has been way easier than it normally is for a weapon review, because literally any clip where I use my Inviswatch is one in which the L'Étranger is benefiting me. Anyway, of course you are worse off when it comes to self-defense if things go wrong, so you need to be more consistent when it comes to just stabbing people in the first place. Of course, having more cloak helps out with that, so it balances out quite nicely. The 15% cloak regained on hit has some uses at times, even if I just see it as a passive bonus that happens to occur when you need to use your gun. But wow, 40% boost to your cloak meter. Look, I don't want to downplay the other revolvers. I still love using the Ambi from time to time, and the Festa revolver is just the nicest looking festive weapon in the game. You should try out the other revolvers, absolutely, but if you haven't used the L'Étranger much, or if you plan on trying to get better at backing stabbing, wow, I almost just said backing stabbing, that's pretty good. Or if you plan on getting better at backstabbing people, this gun is practically built to make the traditional tasks that a spy would want to carry out way more consistent. You still might die, Spy is still really hard, but again, anything that increases your consistency as this class is a godsend. And the L'Étranger does that in spades. I like the L'Étranger a lot. I don't have any joke. This is a weird video to write. Follow me on Twitter.